I'm Amber Duke.
I'm Ben Weingarten.
I'm Inez Stepman.
I'm Will Chamberlain.
And this is NatCon Squad, where common good and common sense meet. NatCon Squad is produced by the Edmund Burke Foundation, the home for national conservatism. Subscribe now on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. Today, we're, of course, covering the big news, Israel and Iran going to war and what the U.S. involvement might look like. Then Will's going to take us through a sort of subset of that debate over what is America first, who is the true representative of the MAGA movement, and the fights emerging between Trump and some of the online right. Then I will talk about the potential for deportation pullbacks and Trump sort of caving on some of his claims about immigrant farm workers and restaurant workers. And then Inez will close us out with a pretty shocking story from Lockheed Martin regarding pretty clear racial discrimination. So with that, we will open with Ben on the Israel war.
Thanks, Amber. So, as everyone knows, the Trump administration had set a 60-day window for negotiations with Iran over denuclearization. And there were debates about the contours of what that would look like and whether Iran would have the ability to enrich uranium or if there would be parts of their nuclear infrastructure that might be produced elsewhere and beyond, and all sorts of palace intrigue around what those negotiations looked like. The 60 days were up as of last Friday, June 13th, my birthday, ironically. And on the 61st day, the two paths that Trump had presented to Iran, the second path revealed itself. The first path was a negotiation, and the second path was one that basically Trump hinted at would be destruction. And Israel engaged in a series of, I think by all accounts, very successful operations, starting with decapitating the military and intelligence leadership within the Iranian regime, taking out a number of nuclear scientists. Reportedly also, they would destroy the backup archive, which basically contained the instructions for their entire nuclear program, which Israel had previously stolen in a very high-stakes mission years ago. And then they moved on to targeting Iran's strategic infrastructure, led by the nuclear facilities, including namely at Natanz, and also taking out launchers, parts of Iran's drone program, I believe, and as well ballistic missiles and beyond. Iran would ultimately respond with a number of barrages of ballistic missiles. As of this recording, the last numbers that I had heard were that Israel's defense systems were around 90% effective based upon the population of strikes that they anticipated being able to neutralize. Obviously, several of those missiles got through. There have been dozens of deaths in Israel and several hundred injuries. But by all accounts, those barrages have diminished in terms of the number of ballistic missiles. But they have targeted population centers in contrast to Israel targeting strategic infrastructure and leadership within Iran. There were also reports that Israel had struck Iran's largest oil field, potentially, certainly, its energy infrastructure, which is really the lifeblood that fills the regime's coffers by way of oil sales, including to China. That's certainly in Israel's sights. There have been dueling reports about whether Ayatollah Khamenei, the supreme leader, is going to be targeted, whether Israel had come to the U.S. with plans and Israel had said, you shouldn't take him out. There's all debate on any number of issues around tactically and strategically here. Israel has also been somewhat ambiguous in terms of its objectives. They've been laid out as denuclearization, destroying the missile program, neutralizing the proxies, and the proxies have interestingly stood down. Many of those proxies had been significantly degraded prior to these strikes. Last but not least, worth noting that Israel maintains the air superiority essentially over Iran. So the big questions now, and there are obviously any number of them, are going to be, what about Fordo, which is sort of the crown jewel and the most hardened nuclear facility? Does Israel have the capability to destroy Fordo without U.S. assistance, whether in the form of being leased or loaned B-2 bombers? What kind of bunker busters does Israel possess Are they capable of, again, actually infiltrating the facility using special forces? They have engaged in some of those operations on the ground before. They had apparently substantial assets in place in these initial phases of the operation. And then a question that I think fewer people have talked about, although there's been a lot of talk about regime change, but to the extent to which Iran's malacracy is ultimately defanged one way or the other, whether it's Israel directly, indirectly, whether or not there's any sort of offensive U.S. action here. To the extent the malacracy is defanged, what does the day after look like? Is there a world where essentially the theocratic Shia Twelver fanatic leadership remains in power, but essentially lacks in all of its military capabilities? Does the regime topple? Is it toppled internally? What does a potential future government there look like? Is there a civil war? All these sorts of questions loom on the back end of this in terms of the day after. But still, we're looking at whether and to what extent Iran's offensive capabilities are degraded with its missile stocks being drawn down and without any of its proxies really engaging Israel at this point. It seems as if it's going to run out of its missile stock at some point. And then the question is going to be, does it plead to go back to the negotiating table to survive? And there have been reports that it has. It doesn't seem like the Trump administration really cares to lead those negotiations. It's basically said they can call us if they want to talk. But it seems as if this might be the death throes of the regime in the form that we understood it. So laying all that out, I would just make two observations at the outset and then turn it over to the group, and we can take this in a lot of different directions. One is that set aside what the assessments were about the state of Iran's nuclear program from the U.S. perspective. I firmly believe that based upon the history and the actions taken, that there's no way that Israel would have taken this action unless it felt it absolutely had to, despite the portrayal of Bibi as a warmonger by some in the West. He's been very hesitant to use decisive force historically. This is a New Jersey-sized country where a ballistic missile barrage or a dirty bomb or nuclear weapon striking it could easily inflict a second Holocaust. It's a country that's been at war basically for 2 years, and that really debilitates basic everyday life within Israel. I don't believe this move would have been taken unless Israel felt that both Iran was at its most vulnerable, but also potentially its most dangerous, and that therefore there was no other choice for its existence but to strike now after letting the Iranian threat and its proxy threats fester for decades now. And then the other aspect, and this is more speculation on my part, and obviously there are people in the intelligence community who will argue otherwise on this, the question of capability. Can Israel independently take out Fordo? In my view, I don't think Israel would have commenced these operations if they didn't have the independent capability to achieve all their objectives. There are these reports about Israel asking the U.S. to help. We don't know whether those reports are accurate. We don't know what the motives are of the people who have put them out. There's been a ton of deception around every single aspect of this war, which is in part what led, I think, to Israel's initial successes and continuing successes. But we just don't know at this point whether Israel really needs assistance, whether in the form of the B-2 bombers, the bunker busters, et cetera, from the U.S., whether it believes it's better for the U.S. to actually potentially drop the weapons necessary to destroy Fordo, whether it can do it on the ground, whether it possesses the capabilities itself. But in my view, again, I don't think Israel would have commenced the operations if it didn't think it could achieve its objectives independently if it had to. So that's kind of my take on the lay of the land right now, 30,000-foot perspective. Happy to turn it over to the group for your impressions of strikes on a regime that is the blood, it's worth noting, of hundreds of Americans on its hands dating back to the bombings in Lebanon, the Beirut barrack bombings, the IEDs that took out hundreds of our troops and injured many thousand more, and that arguably has really been at war with the U.S. since 1979, since the revolution. Turn it over to the group for your initial impressions and thoughts on any of these threads that we could pull on.
Yeah, I think we have not, one of the things I tweeted about yesterday and got a lot of traction, we've not really grappled with how one-sided this conflict has been. It's one of the most one-sided military conflicts in the modern era. Israel, we heard about Iran being a very formidable enemy, tons of ballistic missiles, real air defenses. It's a nation state. It's a huge nation state with I think a bigger GDP than Israel, or roughly comparable. And they've completely fallen over. It's been, no military casualties as far as I can tell, none No plane shot down, no IDF soldiers dead. The only Israeli casualties are civilians that are dying as a result of these ballistic missile barrages, which is just random ballistic missiles being lobbed at Israel. And while that's obviously a tragedy for the Israelis, it has no meaningful military consequence. If the end, and it's extraordinarily expensive. Somebody did the math on it. I mean, the average ballistic missile of this kind for the United States costs about 120 million in a competitive commercial market. Even give Iran the benefit of maybe they get cheaper labor costs and can get these made for 30 million a pop. You're launching 50 at a time. That's $1.5 billion. Iran's how big is their economy? 500 billion. You're talking about they're just 1% of their GDP being launched every single day to kill 5 civilians. That's not sustainable. And I mean, Iran, Israel has enormous, their air superiority means they have these incredible economies of scale. The bombs that Israel's dropping cost tens of thousands of dollars compared to tens of millions. So it's like a factor of 1,000 for the destruction. And then also Israel's bombs are landing exactly where they want them, kind of humorously on the Iranian TV station while it was going live. So what does it mean? I mean, I think the question of Fordo, as I think Ben points out, is almost obsolete now because nobody really accounted for the idea that Israel would completely control Iranian skies. Because if they do, I mean, the Iranian state can't do anything. They can't. I mean, even if they have a nuclear facility in Fordo, can they access it? They're being supervised by Israeli drones overhead. You can just drop a $10,000 bomb at anybody who shows up at the door. So in Iran, I mean, Israel is basically the regional hegemon now. I don't think we've really, who can mess with Israel if they can do something like this? We barely even talk about the fact that they decapitated the entire high command as the first act of the war. I mean, who does that? Imagine a war of the United States, and the first thing that our adversary did was kill Pete Hegseth and all the members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. That's the equivalent. It's crazy how effective Israel's strikes have been, and this will color the later discussion about the American reaction. But people are talking about World War III. This war is already over. It's just a question of it's won. Just the question is, how does Israel want to end it?
I mean, I think that is a really relevant question. What outcomes are acceptable to the Israelis? Notice that their stated goals, and Bibi has done some interviews with English language channels. Their stated goals and Trump's stated goals, frankly, are all related to the nuclear program. And I think that that's probably really important. We'll get a lot more into this in the second segment about the U.S. involvement, but I do fear what would happen in the chaos of because as Will just said, their entire military command has been decapitated. That was long understood to be the power behind the mullahs. And they have their, Khomeini himself is, I think, 84, right? His chosen successor was on that helicopter that was taken down last year. I think probably in some ways it would be better to allow this regime to keep its weak power without the kind of conventional military strength that is Ben and Will have rightly laid out has been much. This war has gone better than a lot of people predicted that anything like this would happen. And I would note on the World War III predictions, Russia and China both seem to be abandoning the Iranians. Now, anything could change. I mean, look, war is an unpredictable business, but as of right now, both the Russians and the Chinese seem to be pulling back. This is a major blow against the Chinese, and we'll get again to U.S. interests in the next sector. But the Chinese are totally dependent on Iran for cheap oil, for cheap energy. China has no energy. And I would note that one of the things that Trump tweeted about when he did the deal that has been highly criticized with China, the trade deal, was that eventually China would be dependent on U.S. energy. Well, that may come to pass if the Iranian regime is completely destroyed, and if Iranian energy is no longer sort of being back channeled to China. They may face much steeper energy costs. So anyway, I still think that this is very much fluid. I agree with what Ben said. I don't think the Israelis would have undertaken this unless they think they can take out the nuclear sites. That probably means for them, or at least to the extent that anyone knows exactly what the Israelis have in their arsenal, that probably means a ground invasion if they actually want to destroy what's there and not just hover indefinitely over in the way that Will suggested and blow up anybody who tries to enter the building. that would mean like ground troops, probably a quite bloody mission on the part of Israelis, and I'm sure they'd like to avoid that if they can. So anyway, that's the situation. By the way, noting all of this stuff, I think Ben and Will gave a really good overview. In the initial days of war, there are always, and I think we all learned this, right, during the invasion in 2022 of Ukraine, there is a lot of misinformation on the internet from all directions. It is really, really hard to get verified information. And I think basically what Will and Ben have said is what we know. There's a lot more speculation about what's happened, but I think that was really well done on both of their parts to contain it to what we know, because right now reports are not reliable.
Yeah, I agree with Inez that I am concerned about the chaos that could arise out of a regime change, and you never really know what you're getting. You ask someone who you think is the worst, and then maybe the worst comes along after that. But I most of my comments I think I'll save for the next portion on sort of the domestic side of this. But one of the interesting things in watching what happened in the breakout of the war was Trump sort of falsely telegraphing that Israel was doing this on its lonesome, sort of lulling the Iranians into a false sense of security, and then revealing, oh, surprise, all along, I was actually giving Israel permission and was willing for them to do this, although there are reports that Trump was pretty clear that he did not want Israel to seek regime change, but only to target Iran's nuclear capabilities. And then there's also been some disputes over the intelligence community's assessment of Iran's nuclear capability. There were statements by Tulsi Gabbard back in March where she was talking about she doesn't believe that Iran is actively seeking a nuclear weapon, but they also have higher uranium stockpiles than they've ever had. Trump was asked about this on Monday and said, basically, I disagree with what she said. And now she's claiming that her comments were sort of taken out of context or the media was misrepresenting them. So that's an active part of this too, is what the IC actually believes, like what the common knowledge is on how close Iran actually is to obtaining the nuclear weapons. There's estimates of days, months, years. And that's all still being reported out as well. So hard to say too much precisely at this point, as we're kind of in the fog of the early days of war.
Yeah, just one note on what Amber said. Yeah, the intelligence side of this operation has been incredible on the part of the Israelis. They apparently know where every single person in high command in Iran is at basically all times. And they have taken out meetings. They have it is kind of it's the pager story on steroids. They seem to have incredibly good intelligence in Iran, and I think that feeds into what Amber just said, right? I think that probably the Israelis have some incredibly accurate estimates of exactly where the Iranians were with their nuclear program, and that probably fed into the timeline of this.
And with that, Will is going to open up the discussion about the fight over MAGA, who is the true America First flag bearer, as we watch the debate over the Israel-Iran conflict.
It's an interesting way of framing it. I think we all are. I think we just have different views on exactly how to achieve what.
That's a good way of putting it.
Serve America's interests. I'm a big tent guy. I want to keep
the diplomatic way.
people. I think everybody's in the tent. Yeah. So yesterday, I mean, this has been going on for quite some time. There's been a lot of people warning President Trump about joining the war in Iran or taking out the nuclear sites. A lot of fear of the knock-on consequences of doing so. And I mean, I think it culminates yesterday in Tucker Carlson on Steve Bannon doing. I think Tucker went on Steve's show. Steve did a podcast with Tucker, and they're both talking about the idea that it would be a terrible thing for it to go into Iran, that Trump is being deceived by his advisors who, don't know better. And I think Trump actually did a pretty good job of putting an end to this with a single truth post. And he said, quote, "Somebody please to explain to kooky Tucker Carlson that, quote, Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon," end quote. And I think nobody should really be surprised by this. You can go back a decade and see nothing but Trump quotes explaining that the one thing he wasn't going to put up with from Iran was a nuclear weapon. So it's not surprising this has been his long-term view. I think a lot of people on our side, I mean, Trump is anti-regime change war. That much is clear. He's not for getting bogged down in Middle Eastern conflicts. He's never done it. But he's also not averse to striking targets in the Middle East. And I remember the first term, we had strikes against Assad in Syria. We took out ISIS in Syria as well. He struck Soleimani, the Iranian general, killed him. And then this term, we have already had strikes in Yemen. So it's not like he's averse to striking. He just doesn't want to get bogged down. It's like, okay, once you understand that, you'll understand when Trump's looking to do something with Iran, it's not, he doesn't want to get bogged down there either. And he wants to protect American blood and American treasure to the extent possible. So, what did he do? Well, he let Israel take the lead. They've as he just posted recently that they just secured Iranian airspace. It's like, okay, well, then now the question is, do we use the one unique function that America has that Israel doesn't militarily in the context of Iran, which is we have B-2 bombers and the bunker busters to take out Fordo. We might do it, we might not. I don't think it ultimately matters, but this is the circumstance. Trump is happy to come in and win the war at that point. So with that context, I for a number of days I've thought the stakes where in the kind of hyperbole surrounding American involvement in this war was just way overblown. Like, this is not Iraq. We're not going in, invading, sending ground troops in, trying to occupy Iran, change the government, and stay there until that government is stable. We're not doing that. At most, this would be strikes, and we've seen strikes before. So there was I never saw the idea of there being a catastrophe being reasonable. On the other hand, I also thought it's not like we're, either way, what we're trying to accomplish, the Israelis are going to accomplish in any event. Probably it'll just take them a little longer. Like it'll take one of our bombs from the B-2 will end the Fordo plant today, but the Israelis would have been able to take out the Fordo plant over a couple of weeks. Okay, so it's not really that different. And so I thought people really were just overestimating how high the stakes were. And yet there were just a huge number of influencers on the conservative MAGA side really invested, I think, in the restraint thesis. And I think the dynamic at play, it's not limited to this, but there's a lot of cases in which people get ego invested in their predictions and their analysis, right? They make predictions and analysis about the way the world's going to work if something happens. And then if it doesn't work that way, they kind of double down and get stuck in and get even more aggressive and hyperbolic. And that's what I think happened with the restraint thesis. A lot of people on the MAGA right convinced themselves that Trump agreed with them on Iran when he didn't. And you could just look at his public statements to see that. And those same people convinced themselves that in the world where the United States got involved, the lead of World War III, Russia and China, Tucker has posts about Russia and China intervening on Iran's behalf. None of that happened. None of that will happen. Iran is a paper tiger. And there's an extent to which I think it's understandable, given how poorly regime change wars have gone in the past, and given the overwhelming amount of reporting about the strength of Iran and the fact that they had a decent amount of money. This is not a dirt poor country. And they'd invest that money in these ballistic missiles. There was just this assumption that a war against Iran would be much more damaging and destructive than it turns out to have been. And I think once everybody kind of adapts to the new reality, the post-June 13th reality, where, it turns out actually Iran was really, really weak. And their lack of air defenses mean that they can't stop Israel from doing anything. And the success and the lightning speed of the Israeli strikes at the very beginning mean that the ballistic missiles aren't nearly as much of a threat as they were turned out to be. All Iran can do is spend $1.5 billion to kill a half dozen civilians at a time. So it turns out, we don't, people can just stop catastrophizing and everything will be okay. And I think it's very useful that the president has just kind of slapped this down and said, no, Iran doesn't get to have a nuclear weapon. I've said that repeatedly. That's my policy, period. And I don't think there's a need for a permanent fracture. There's so many people talking about, well, this is going to fracture the MAGA base. It's like, I don't think it will. I think the people who are really overly invested in this are people who are just totally either personally ego invested in their theses about foreign policy, which are looking like they've been disproven by facts on the ground, or people who are just deeply hostile to Israel. And that is an incredibly tiny fraction of the MAGA base. And so I think everybody, in a week, everybody will come around and realize, this really wasn't that big a deal. Turns out Trump was right. Trust the plan. Just be cool.
Well, on the polling side of Americans, right, there are these two polling propositions among Americans, which Trump has been repeating since he came down in fact, in that speech, I think when he came down the escalator, right, 10 years ago, he talked about the impossibility of allowing Iran to get a nuclear weapon. That is a very popular position in America. going to war against Iran is an incredibly unpopular proposition in America. So that's like the baseline polling. I'm sure Trump is very aware of that. Just a few notes on kind of our strategic position here. I don't think it's quite as sewn up or easy as maybe as Will suggests in terms of our involvement in this. I think we should be realistic. First of all, I agree that actually the issue of who's dropping a bomb on a nuclear facility is actually some of the smallest issue. We will be resupplying Israel, right? We have moved our tanker. We've moved our aircraft carrier away, right, from other places that they're deployed. They're now in the Middle East. We've moved our resupply and our refueling planes so that potentially those planes could at any point become part of this war effort and help Israel because the logistics of flying a bombing campaign from Israel, they can't land anywhere in between. They don't have anywhere to resupply or refuel. It's a very technically difficult operation that the Air Force in Israel is carrying out. And the other thing is they will need us to resupply Iron Dome, right? These barrages of missiles, yes, they're not as expensive as the ones that Iran is firing. And I think it's really helpful to understand how much money each side is spending for what military gain. But, they will need us to resupply their air defense as well. So the question is how much U.S. involvement. And by the way, I'm not against U.S. involvement. I just think that it's important to lay out. I don't think that there's a totally clean way for the U.S. to completely wipe our hands and just let Israel take care of this entire problem and not have to invest anything from the American side once this started. I kind of think we will end up, and then that does drive my fear, for example, of regime change, because I think one way or the other, if there is a chaotic vacuum of pieces of, remember, Iran is an empire. They have little pieces of ethnic, they have ethnic strife. They have different ethnic groups around the borders, and there's still a lot of wealth, a lot of oil, and potentially, bits and pieces of the nuclear program floating around after. So I think stability could possibly become something that falls in the United States lap. And then once again, we are involved in this kind of war that we don't want to be involved in. All that being said, and then, the final sort of cautious note I would put on this is strategically, right? This would be a really good time for China to start making problems in Taiwan, right? We're shifting our assets. If you're in the Bridge Colby camp in the administration, right, this is what you did not want to see, is the U.S. shifting its military assets from across the globe, and most of it aimed and sort of positioned towards the East, back into the Middle East. And so I do think there are costs for the United States in this war. That being said, I think that it is obviously an American interest, one that Trump has repeated over and over and over again, that Iran not get a nuclear bomb. And by the way, the Israeli intelligence and our own intelligence to some extent says that, okay, they weren't just working on a single nuclear bomb to sort of wield the way that North Korea wields. They have really good missile technology, and they are seeking to put that on ICBMs that could reach Europe, could reach the coast of the United States, right? They want to have that kind of leverage over the whole globe. That is really what they were racing towards. That is obviously something not only that's unacceptable for Israel. I think any reasonable person would see that is not a good situation for the United States. That is an unacceptable situation for the United States. So, and something that, again, Trump has said, one of the few things in which it's been tariffs. Iran can't have a nuke. And immigration, a wall. There's been a few core things that he's been repeating over and over again in a way that he's more ideologically flexible about a lot of other things. And this is one of them. By the way, just finally, summing up Trump's foreign policy to me is very, you get a lot of people claiming to sort of fly the Trump flag on foreign policy. And that's true somewhat on domestic policy, but I think even more so, it becomes more obvious in foreign policy. Trump is not a neocon, and he's not a paleocon. He's not I don't think there is an ideological word for the kind of foreign policy that Trump is conducting. The closest thing is Jacksonianism, that Meade created category of various strains of U.S. foreign policy. But I think actually he's quite open about his foreign policy. The tactics are hidden, but the aims of the foreign policy are very, very clear. Usually he told them he had 60 days. Before that, he warned Putin publicly. He said, you don't know what I'm holding back. And a week later, the drone attack went through from Ukraine, right? So I think that he's actually quite transparent. It's that you can get a deal, probably a better deal than a previous president might have offered, but there's a huge stick on the other end. And that's what we're seeing. And the final point on the non-ideological foreign policy of Trump, I think, is that he, as often as he listens to his advisors, he uses them as a element in negotiation and communicating to the people who are on the other side of the table, his adversaries, right? So he publicly said he used John Bolton that way. He said, I loved having John Bolton next to me when I walked into the negotiating room because everybody on the other side of the table knew that that guy wants to bomb them, right? I think in a very similar way, he's using some of the doves in his administration and was using some of the doves in his administration to back up his offer of peace. But now that has, very clearly been shown that he's not sort of only listening to that wing of his advisors. He's not controlled by his advisors. He's ultimately, if anything, he's using his advisors to sometimes trickily communicate something that he wants his enemies to believe, right? So anyway, I think there could probably be a whole book written about Trump's foreign policy in a serious way. Once again, we see that a lot of commentators, a lot of the things that Trump says that they think are crazy, then or irrelevant. You get these two camps, like with the 60-day deadline, the two camps chattering and yelling at each other, one being like, yes, he wants peace, and the other one, and he wants to negotiate, and the other one being like, oh, he himself is a paper tiger, he never follows through on anything, blah, blah, blah. And they yell at each other. And then Trump does exactly what he said he would do at the end of these. So I just feel like there's always this huge speculation, and then we come to the conclusion that Trump is actually doing exactly what he said he was going to do. So that's my assessment of his foreign policy. And I think he probably has really good instincts in this very delicate and difficult situation. And I guess I'll sum it up by saying I trust the plan too.
I think Inez, hit a lot of the concerns that I have pretty well. I mean, when I hear the Lindsey Grahams and the Mark Levins of the world cheering on Trump and trying to kind of push the regime change war, I'm like, oh God, what the heck are we doing? And that's when I get into the panikin camp, and I'm trying not to be a panikin, but I'm probably one of the more anti-interventionist and Israel skeptic members of this panel, at least. So I definitely am watching with bated breath, okay, what is Trump going to do? Are we going to give them the bunker busters, or are we going to sort of watch from the sideline and supply Israel with military supplies and financial backing and kind of let them do their thing? I also think the other important part of this is that there's rightful skepticism of the intelligence community and its assessments on Iran. I mean, it's no question that Israel has really great intelligence on Iran based on the strikes that we saw to start off the war. I mean, literally flying drones through windows of meetings of top officials and just taking them out pretty systematically, which was, frankly, incredible to watch and pretty badass. But I mean, at the same time, there's all of these conflicting reports about Iran's nuclear capabilities that I mentioned earlier. And I just want to make sure that people aren't being taken for a ride, which I think is probably where a lot of the responses from the online right have come from the Tucker Carlsons have come from. It's just the skepticism of the IC, which is maybe some PTSD from the Iraq war too, as well, right? And the weapons of mass destruction and all of the Bush era comments. But it's going to be interesting to watch whether or not the coalition comes back together. I think it does depend on how Trump ultimately responds to this. If we do get roped into a war, I think a lot of those really non-interventionist skeptics are going to be very reticent to come back into the fold. And likewise, if Trump pulls back entirely and goes straight into negotiations, then is he going to lose maybe the more hawkish elements of the base? So I think it's a very testy situation right now. I'm kind of curious to see what happens. And again, trying not to be a panican.
I think it's worth noting that Iran's ability to hurt the U.S. directly or indirectly diminishes the further Israel goes in degrading all of its capabilities. So I think when you think about how do we secure America's vital interests, given what has transpired to date, what do we care about? Well, we care about the Straits of Hormuz remaining open and not having massive shocks to energy prices. We care about the China-Russia implications of this. And I think, as Inez noted, China and Russia, to me, it seems like they're basically cutting loose a losing hand, what they perceive to be a losing hand at this point, based upon the reporting that we've heard. We care about, first and foremost, probably above all else, our military assets in the region. And right now, it appears that our bases have been secured. And again, either Iran's proxies are standing down, their command and control structure is eviscerated. Maybe they are essentially defecting from the regime and they're going to go out on their own. It's not clear at this point why they haven't acted, if they lack the capability, if they lack the will, or something else. But thank God our assets and personnel to date have been secured. And I will say, by the way, that I think any Israeli action, Iran et al. Would blame the U.S. They would say this is the Zionist entity working on behalf of the great Satan, period, full stop. Obviously, the extent of our involvement, they will probably calibrate their response to the extent of it, but it's not as if they abide by rules of war, laws of war, customs, and they say, oh, well, if the U.S. just engages in this defensive action, well, we're not really going to strike them. But if they go this far, then we're going to do something. I think ultimately they're going to say it's the U.S. Israel is just the U.S.'s stalking horse, essentially. But obviously, their justification and their propaganda will grow to the extent the U.S. ends up more involved, which is yet to be seen at this point. And then also, I'm concerned about our own city streets. And it's also interesting, we haven't heard of anything about Hezbollah threats to the homeland, other proxy groups. I hope that our national security apparatus rolled up those networks in the very early hours after Israel's strikes. But that's also something to be concerned about. But again, these threats diminish the more the regime is degraded. And Israel is essentially doing the dirty work to take out a regime that is the world's leading state sponsor of jihad, that again has had the blood of Americans on its hands, that has threatened our troops in the region who have been sitting ducks. We're sitting ducks under Joe Biden. And so, separating that for a second from the conflict, to the extent there is one on the online right or beyond, I sort of take Will's view at a very simplistic level that there are no doubt generational differences on what U.S. national security and foreign policy ought to look like. Those differences are no doubt informed in part by what we've seen over the last 20 or 30 years. The notion, in my view, that the deep state has been all about regime change in Iran and that they've been wrong about the that the assessments of Iran's nuclear capabilities, et cetera, that they've been wrong to the overly concerned direction, I just think are belied by the facts. I mean, they've consistently tamped down the idea that Iranian's nuclear program is on a threshold. We know that the intel assessments have been wildly wrong. I think that Israel's human intelligence in this case, and the fact that they felt compelled to act, suggests that they clearly felt there was an existential threat. And the U.S. deep state and national security intelligence apparatus has always wanted to make deals, with the regime, and has never wanted to engage in military action, really, against Iran. So I do think that is belied by the factual record. But even setting all that aside, at the end of the day, Inez is right to look to the polls to some extent. We'll see if the polls shift at all, maybe based upon Israel's success or not. But Israel's essentially doing our dirty work. And if you look at what Bridge Colby said about Israel being a model ally, in fact, they are pretty much being what the model ally looks like in a situation like this. U.S. interests look like they're secured, if anything, maybe more secure after the strikes that have taken place. And at the end of the day, I think that the fight, while it's very loud on the internet, I don't think it's as widespread among the base writ large. And again, we'll have to see among polling. And there are polls, no doubt, two polls, and I don't mean polls, P-O-L-L, but two polls, P-O-L-Es, on these conflicts and what the U.S. proper role is and what the size, scope, and nature of the threats are and how to best ameliorate them and what the U.S. Potential liabilities should be in it. But at the end of the day, at this point, we're not very heavily involved. I don't see there being some clamoring on the right among the quote unquote neocons for U.S. troops on the ground, occupy Iran for years, take out the regime, and then install a Jeffersonian democracy there. Maybe it exists. I haven't really seen it. It seems like the kind of Tucker wing has strawmanned what the other side of the argument is. There are no doubt some people calling for regime change because they would make the argument, well, look, at the end of the day, it's not nuclear weapons that are the real problem. It's the regime that might use them that's the problem. And we can have a debate about that and whether the regime really would have intended to use nuclear weapons and beyond. But I do think where there is merit to the quote unquote restrainer side of this is to the extent that the malacracy does fall, we don't know what the next day looks like. And on the one hand, I think the historical examples are useful from the perspective of we don't know what the next day looks like. On the other hand, Iran is not Iraq or Afghanistan. Iran was a once secular, pro-Western, modern country, probably more like a Shia version of the way Turkey was prior to Erdogan, probably. This was a friend of the U.S. This was not a hostile, belligerent power. This was not the world's leading state sponsor of jihad. Now, on the other hand, you've had generations of those liberal Iranians who have left to the extent they could get out. And you've had the corrosive activities and the persecution of them by the malacracy such that we don't really know where the population is today. And we don't know who would have the organized force, the might, or the right necessary to prevail over the population and what a post-mullahcratic government looks like there. So I think we ought to be very cautious and hesitant and concerned about what would come next. We ought to be securing our vital interests. It would be great if the most catastrophic of the weapons are destroyed in this conflict so that we're not afraid that terrorist groups are going to get their hands on weapons or the next regime is worse and it has its hands and possesses these weapons. But I think it's worth considering all sides, basically. That on the one hand, Iran is not Iraq or Afghanistan. On the other hand, we don't know, and it's very unpredictable what happens. And it will be a fluid situation, and outside actors would try to exploit it. So, in my view, personally, I've said this before, I think let Israel cook. Let Israel do what it needs to do to secure its interests. And the U.S. should not have to engage offensively here. And the U.S. should not take a position on the regime ultimately and what it looks like. And we ought to focus on securing ourselves. But on the other hand, I do think that at the end of the day, what Israel is doing right now is certainly positive. We don't know what tomorrow holds, but this is ameliorating a grave threat that, again, has the blood of Americans on its hands, and we should be grateful for that.
I just want to underscore with one sentence what Ben said. The deep state, the intelligence deep state, is basically a creature of Barack Obama. And I think it's important to remember that. It's actually like, it's leftist, but it's not like there's also a lot of people on the left that wouldn't fit in with like the views of the foreign policy blob in DC. I think it is like, it is really a creature of Obama's foreign policy. And I think it's important to remember that.
And then my final point would be on the regime change thing is like the other concern is obviously not necessarily even who takes over, but if anti-American sentiment brews within the populace, which is kind of what we saw after the CIA-backed coup in the 50s, leading to the revolution in 1979. So there's all these moving parts to consider, but we've gone way over time. So I'll go ahead and move on to my segment on deportations, and I'll try to keep it relatively brief so we can make up some time on the back end. But Trump was saying last week that he was intending on scaling back deportations of illegal immigrant farm laborers, restaurant workers, hotel workers, and other sort of key industries that he thinks are pretty reliant on illegal immigrant labor. Now we've had the Washington Post reporting that Trump is now reneging on that decision because I think a lot of backlash from the base, which wants to see essentially every illegal immigrant deported. And I consider myself part of this camp. I had a newsletter come out this morning for the Daily Caller about Trump trying to pull back on those deportations. And a lot of the arguments that we hear for illegal immigrant labor is, well, prices are going to go up if you deport all of these people, and also Americans don't want to take the jobs. And I think they're both pretty fallacious arguments. I mean, the first point on prices going up, like maybe marginally, yes, if you're paying American workers who work for higher wages, but at the same time, we've had a massive drain on public resources from illegal immigrants to the tune of tens of billions of dollars every single year that are not accounted for in these calculations. There's also a massive strain on housing, right? This was something J.D. Vance brought up on the campaign trail, and a New York Times reporter sort of scoffed at him for suggesting that 25 million illegal immigrants might lead to a shortage of housing supply. Housing and gas were the two largest drivers of inflation during the Biden administration. So I think suggesting that getting rid of 20 million illegal immigrants and freeing up some housing for Americans and potentially driving those costs down would help ameliorate inflation is obviously not illogical. And then on the point about Americans not wanting these jobs, I mean, maybe for certain wages and lack of benefits, then yeah, they won't take those jobs. But if they're paid the right amount, they will do them. And the Center for Immigration Studies, I think, does the best work on actually breaking down the Bureau of Labor Statistics data, where they look at some of these supposedly critical fields like agriculture and restaurants and hotels or maid work or landscaping. And they point out that not a single one of these industries is majority immigrant, whether legal or illegal. They're 60 to 70% filled by Americans. And really, there's only like five occupations in the entire country that are majority immigrant. One of them is something like nail salons, which are usually filled by legal Vietnamese immigrants. It's not farm labor. It's not people picking fruit. It's not people cleaning toilets, as the left likes to talk about when they talk about deportations. And we saw a recent example of exactly what happens when illegal immigrants are deported. There was a big raid at a food production facility in Omaha, Nebraska. And the next day, they had their entire waiting room stocked to the brim of people who wanted to take those jobs. And I think you would see similar things around the country if Americans were told that they had the opportunity to take those positions. I think there's sort of this self-perpetuating cycle where because certain corporations, whether it's big ag or what have you, are willing to pay under the table labor or very cheap labor that Americans need not apply. And so they don't even bother. And even outside the economic questions, just before I kick it to the group, there's also a cultural question, right? Which is like, what is the purpose of a nation? Is it to be a shopping mall? Is it to be an economic zone where the number one goal is to just provide the cheapest labor possible so that companies can increase their profit margins? Or is it to think about the best interests of the citizens and the people who actually have an allegiance to the country and who deserve to have their interests protected? So I was really glad to see that Trump reconsidered this after just a week. They're still obviously going to target criminal illegal aliens, and he mentioned blue cities in recent remarks. But I hope that as the mass deportation program continues, that we will start to see every illegal immigrant shuttled out of the country. And by the way, these two things aren't mutually exclusive either. While you're on the hunt, while you're serving these warrants for the criminal illegals, it is entirely possible while you're there in these communities to pick up other people who don't have their papers too. With that, I'll turn it to the group to hear your thoughts on Trump sort of seemingly backing down on a promise and then turning the other direction.
Yeah, I mean, I pointed this out last week that it's not, in fact, just possible. It's more likely in blue states that are engaging in sanctuary state policies for people who are not on the enforcement priority list to get picked up, because it requires ICE to go out to do sweeps into the community. And a lot of times, people are living together or around each other, or hanging out with other, right? So I think it's actually more likely, given the policy choices that blue states have made. Look, frankly, I love the big blue city parts of this, right? I do think that we should, it's a matter of priorities, I guess I would say. And I can kind of see why it makes sense to give a little more time to American businesses. If they're not looking, if you are an American business operating in large part on the labor of illegal immigrants, if you are not trying desperately to, switch over your business practices right now, you're an idiot. So I can see like the virtue of giving more time and having lower priority to give, sort of that part of the American economy time to transfer over, to find different business practices, to, change their labor practices, to hire more Americans, to like try to find where the price point is at which, Americans will come in and do the jobs that they've been doing under the table, and whether that works for their bottom line. Like, I understand this is all, it's new and it's complicated, but ultimately, I don't know. I kind of thought this was more of a messaging thing than anything else. I don't see. The fact is that we aren't, as of now, we are not doing large scale sweeps, where we're trying to pick up random people for the most part for not having their papers. The people who ICE is going after right now are people who either have, full deportation orders from the courts, right? Or they have other criminal records, or like there's some other nexus, right? And I think that makes sense, right? It's not because I don't think the law should be enforced against people whose only crime was to break immigration law as opposed to other, but it makes sense to come after the people who have broken other of our laws first. And to give more time in transition to the economic consequences that will result from deporting a lot of people who are illegally in the country. So I don't know. I see this more as a messaging and priorities thing than I see it as an end goal. I can't see Trump really backing off of the goal of immigration enforcement and mass scale deportations. And seems like he's well on his way to doing that. And as a final note, one of Mitt Romney's only great ideas, right? These enforcements do make people self-deport, which the Trump administration is, as we discussed a few podcasts ago, helping them along by encouraging them with a check, right, through the same app program that the Biden administration used to give them a quasi-legal status. Trump is using to, send them a check if they go back to their home countries, and we don't have to go and get them, right? So I think that there are stages to this enforcement, and clearly the first priority should be those people who are endangering Americans further by their presence. And it makes sense to me to go in that order.
Yeah. I think you hit on the really important point here, why this needed to be reversed. Self-deportation is going to be incredibly important. Physically deporting 20 million people is almost impossible. It requires a lot of resources and energy. We want to create an environment in which illegal aliens self-deport. You can't do that if there are sectors of the economy that are seen as safe havens for illegal aliens, that they'll be able to stick around for years while everybody else gets deported. As an illegal alien, you should be constantly afraid that at some point somebody will come and pick you up. So not only, and also I have no sympathy for the companies who are engaged in the hiring of illegal labor. You are in flagrant violation of federal law. You should be glad that you aren't being prosecuted for it. So, and I think that I heard it was Brooke Rollins who was behind pushing for this. That was what was reported. If so, she should be thoroughly marginalized. I mean, I don't really care who the Secretary of Agriculture is. Just send her back to the Ag Department and keep her out of the White House. Real simple fix there. There's plenty of secretaries in the government who don't really get to see the president on a day-to-day basis. Her name should just be added to the list.
Someone probably already coined this phrase, but thinking during this conversation, sanctuary sectors ought to be a new part of the lexicon, I think. Look, I think from a political perspective and probably from a substantive perspective as well, definitely from a substantive perspective, using finite resources to prioritize the worst of the worst illegal aliens who pose a national security threat to our homeland makes inordinate sense. But mass deportations, and that probably includes self-deportation, was always the plan. It was the stated plan, and it was wildly popular with the American people in polls. I do agree to some extent with Inez that this is sort of a media-created frenzy, I think, around, oh my God, they're rounding up the most sympathetic potential cases of illegal aliens working in the U.S. We haven't really seen the widespread escalation there, although it does appear it may be coming. But that was the policy. Having sort of highly visible raids, of course, does have a self-deportation component to it as well. But I think that workplace enforcement in and of itself, that is ultimately where this policy survives and thrives or dies. And that there will be political warfare around that because you are going to have, I mean, obviously we know that the left and regime media, they've been perfectly content to defend gangbangers. So of course they're going to, try to portray these stories with profiles, sob stories of people who have been here for X number of years. They built a life here. They contribute, they're pillars of their communities. They pay taxes, even though they're using fraudulent papers to be able to work on the books, et cetera, et cetera. That is where this policy is going to survive or not. And it's going to be fascinating to see what the administration's strategy and tactics are to ultimately deal with the workplace enforcement piece. But once again, it's worth noting, big business here is on the other side, and they're going to resist as strongly as they can, just as they are the resistors on the China policy and the tariff policy as well. It is always the big business at the end of the day that, ironically, because the business of the U.S. is business, stands in the way of actually our national interests with respect to these policies. So will Trump have the fortitude to go head to head with and break big business on this? Yet to be seen. But that is, to me, where the policy survives or not, workplace enforcement.
Yeah, that's an important point, Ben. And I think there's this false perception that getting rid of illegal immigrants hurts small businesses the most. It's actually usually the mega corporations. New York Times did an amazing profile a few years ago about illegal immigrant minors working in major factories like cereal companies and really insane stuff. And then real quick on Will's point about Brooke Rollins, she was also one of the big pushers for the criminal justice reform, the First Step Act during the first admin. So I was skeptical of her coming in the first place, and this obviously did not help matters. But for our final segment, we're going to go to Inez, who's going to talk about Lockheed Martin's open racial discrimination and some of the shocking details from that report.
Yeah, good thing that the world is so calm when our this is the state of our military industrial complex back home. But so Chris Rufo has a bombshell report based on whistleblowing from within the corporation that unfortunately, it dropped about 5 days ago, and Israeli bombs started dropping about 4 days ago. So it has fallen out of the news, but I really wanted to highlight it here before it just sort of disappears into the ether of the news cycle. So Lockheed Martin has, based on the documents, this whistleblower, who by the way resigned, filed an internal ethics complaint and then resigned. These are documents from 2022, so there's really good evidence that he tried to take this to the top internally and point out how wrong this was, and the company very intentionally ignored him and dismissed his concerns. So what kind of documents is he bringing forward? Well, to be blunt about it, really, really obvious written down racial discrimination against white employees in Lockheed Martin, to the point where these documents are like, okay, each one of these teams, you have to give out their end of the year bonuses. Structure in this kind of corporate environment, for those who are not super familiar, bonuses are a huge part of your salary, right? It's a big part. Like, there's a baseline salary and there's potential to get like a huge bonus at the end of the year. So this is not like, oh, you get $100 in your stocking for Christmas. Because I know, like, for those of us who work in the nonprofit sector, that's usually what a bonus is, right? This is a huge part of the compensation structure at the end of the year. And these documents are literally just the higher ups telling this manager and other managers, you need to drop off X names of white people off your bonus list and add this many POC names. It is that explicit. It is, you have to take earned bonuses from employees because they're white and give them to employees who are not white, because we want this racial balancing to come out right at the end of this at the end of this year. That's about the clearest racial discrimination case the EEOC has seen in 50 years, 70 years. And Lockheed Martin was not the only one, obviously, practicing this. I've spoken many times about the public announcements that a lot of these Fortune 500 companies, which we talked about in the immigration context last segment, but a lot of these Fortune 500 companies are willing to engage in the most blatantly illegal and discriminatory tactics against their white employees. And they did it in the name of social justice and all the isms that have been such a prominent part of our politics for the last 5 years. I think it's incredibly important that we take a few of these companies and nail their scalps to the wall as both a warning and a continual message to the rest of these corporations that this is illegal, it won't be tolerated, and you're going to pay through the nose if you've done it. And I think this is going to work. Like, as in the university or the academic context, I tend to think, it's going to take a lot of pain before that sector does anything like a turnaround or tries to, backs away from some of their most lunatic ideas. Corporate America, even though it does wing culturally left, it's much easier to scare them, right? With a big lawsuit. A large part of why they adopted these tactics to begin with was fear of either bad PR or, frankly, of bad enforcement of our civil rights laws by Democratic administrations. So I think it's really important that we do the same thing. And fortunately, there are two really important appointees the Trump administration has made with regard to this. One is Harmeet Dillon, a lot of us good friend in these parts, Harmeet Dillon, who is going to be overseeing a lot of the Justice Department's civil rights work. She is incredible, and she's a great asset, and it's going to become important as these cases wind their way up. And the second appointment, a little bit less well known because the EEOC isn't as well known. That's the agency that enforces anti-discrimination law in the workplace, enforces the Civil Rights Act with regard to the workplace. And the best commissioner we had on there was Andrea Lucas. She was a commissioner appointed by Trump, but then was able to serve out a term under Biden. But she, if you missed some of the ways she's entered the discourse, she's very like, she's not a she's not like a Twitter sphere person, but she did go on to Twitter on X to respond to Mark Cuban in the midst of the 2020s when he said, "Oh, like, we put a thumb on the scale. We try to get qualified applicants, but then we want to diversify and we put a thumb on the scale." And she responded to him and said, "I know that you're just talking on X, but what you're talking about is completely illegal. And I want to make that clear. Like, the federal government will come after you if you do this." And she's been very outspoken on that. So she has now been elevated to the chair of that commission. And so her confirmation hearings are coming up. Like, we wish her the best over here. But she is going to be an incredible asset in enforcing Title VII against some of these corporations. And again, I think top line, Lockheed Martin needs to be in that batch to me. They need to be in that top batch of corporations because this is so blatant, guys. This is incredible. And I know I've heard a lot of stories from friends who work in big corporations that are just as blatant. But I mean, here it is in black and white. No pun intended, right? Take money from white people, from white employees who've earned their bonuses, give bonuses to employees their supervisors did not grant them because of the color of their skin. So I think this needs to be made an example of. So with that, I'll turn it over to the group.
Yeah, this Lockheed Martin story was insane. Make them the Harvard University of corporations. I completely agree. I was shocked when I saw the details from this. And, obviously on this podcast and anyone who follows Chris Rufo knows the extent to which corporations have been getting away with this kind of thing for a long time. But to me, this was one of the most clear-cut cases I've seen, which just makes them, I think they should be absolutely ground zero for the EEOC to make an example.
I think, we need to name, shame, expose, and then enforce the law vigorously. I totally agree with Inez's point. Corporations are risk averse. They don't want political headaches, and that significantly increases the odds that they won't resist the way that you have some universities trying to resist and fighting tooth and nail. They're less ideological, even if they lean left. And whether that's because you think the executives lean left or because the executives fear the newer employees or they fear basically the protection racket that exists among the left-wing, quote-unquote, NGOs that threaten them. At the end of the day, fear of the scorn and opprobrium publicly plus government enforcement, I think will have a meaningful impact, and we'll see over the next 5 to 10 years whether that proves out or not. But the last point I'd make is it is worth noting this is Lockheed Martin. We're talking about a very strategically significant sector here, and maybe the most important company within that sector. These are parts of the country, institutions, where you cannot have the corrosive bigotry in reverse, and it's not in reverse, it's just bigotry of DEI, because ultimately it's going to reduce the merit within the employee base, and that's going to lead to worse products and worse services. And you simply can't have that in an area like defense contracting or a slew of other areas of our country. And obviously we know that this worldview has also prevailed when it comes to medicine and in a whole slew of other critical industries as well. So this is just one more reminder that there are probably real world consequences and people will die and have died, I'm sure, as a consequence of the bigotry that's been baked into sectors just like these and businesses just like these. There's a real cost to it that goes beyond one person losing out and one person gaining who shouldn't have been in that position, or people being in a position but always questioning whether they got it because of traits that have nothing to do with what they bring to the table. But there's also a real substantive cost and impact as well. And that's another reason why it's an imperative to get the bigotry out of the businesses, and government enforcement and litigation here is a very useful tool in bringing these sectors back to the business of their businesses.
Yeah, to underscore what Ben just said, that one of the managers who was involved in pushing this lower level manager to discriminate on the basis of race is now in charge of the F-35 program in Lockheed.
Yeah, I'm with all this. I think Ben hit on one of the biggest points, which is that our national security contractors cannot be discriminating on this way because they're going to be discriminating against meritorious employees who are helping build the military equipment for our military to to protect our country. The idea that they'd be engaged in this sort of racial discrimination is just unthinkable and appalling. I pin them, we can't tolerate it. I mean, what happens if some of these people, are so dissuaded by this they'd leave the field and they would have otherwise had their talents used to help our military out? It's crazy that it even happened. And pin Lockheed to the wall and make them if in the end result of this is that they go bankrupt as a result of the judgment against them and the United States is able to restructure them, all the better.
With that, we're going to do final thoughts, and maybe we can keep these to like a minute to 2 minutes or less. Mine is just on the New York nuns case. Supreme Court sent it back to the lower courts to reevaluate. They have been fighting New York's mandatory abortion law. So we're going to keep an eye on that and see if anything develops from the lower courts. Maybe it'll end up back at the Supreme Court, but good news so far for the nuns who are facing another Obama era attack on religious freedom.
My final thought is just following up on the ever-changing situation in Iran. We have a series of truths from Donald Trump saying we are in control of the skies around Iran. We being the United States, which was confirmed in that use by the White House by follow-up questions. So so apparently the United States now controls the sky across over Iran, and then. The second follow-up truth saying we know exactly where the Ayatollah is hiding. We are not going to kill him for now, but, quote, our patience is wearing thin. Thank you for your attention to this matter. So very Trumpian.
Yeah, the unconditional surrender tweet is wonderful. We're in Ulysses S. Grant territory or FDR territory. I don't know. I think Iran, the Iranian regime, given that, I think the Iranian regime is probably on its last legs. People, rebuilding Iran will be a real challenge. But at this point, as I've described earlier, the Iranian state can't even really function. They don't have control of their air. They don't have control of their airspace. They can be bombed from anywhere at any time. And they can't meaningfully do anything to Israel beyond a few more days of flinging dumb ballistic missiles at their civilian population.
The hour totally overshadowed a couple things. We didn't even get to talk about Senator Padilla, they didn't know was Senator Padilla at the time, rushing the DHS secretary, and relatedly as well, the No Kings rallies, the violence associated with them, and the sort of pro-Reconquista efforts out of Los Angeles, and another asinine and dangerous and republic-threatening district court judge ruling from Justice Stephen Breyer's brother out of San Francisco, District Court Judge Charles Breyer. His ruling, he basically said Trump can't federalize the National Guard. Under the law, basically, the president can federalize the National Guard under situations where law and order isn't maintained. The administration did so under the guise on the argument of protecting federal assets, namely ICE agents that were not getting protection from state and local authorities. This is another decision which is very analogous to a lot of these Alien Enemies Act decisions from district court judges, where the district court judges, of course, will concede that the president has the power to use these various authorities. But they say, well, he didn't pick the right situation, or he hasn't substantiated his claims that the conditions are met necessary to justify using his powers. So who gets to decide whether we have a predatory incursion, or there's an insurrection, or there's lawlessness on the ground, or ICE agents are threatened and state and local authorities aren't doing the job? Is it District Court Judge Charles Breyer or one of hundreds of other district court judges, or should it be the president? And if it is not the court's job, isn't it the president? And then if Congress has an issue with it, Congress can use all of its authorities to check and balance the president if it wants to. This is ultimately going to go to the Supreme Court, this notion of who determines when the conditions need be met. Hopefully the court rules rightly on that. But that aside, continues to be, this judicial insurrectionism from lower courts persists. The Ninth Circuit stayed that ruling. We'll see how it ultimately plays out. But you can expect probably copycat litigation in other jurisdictions as the anti-immigration enforcement protests/riots continue to percolate through what's sure to be a hot summer.
Well, thanks everyone for watching and listening. That's going to do it for us this week. On behalf of Inez, Will, and Ben, I'm Amber Duke, and we will see you at the next NatCon Squad.